2 weeks ago, Owen Murphy's Emergency Housing Summit turned the focus on the thousands of homes lying empty across the state. Some people, though, have taken it upon themselves to put a small number of these properties to use, or as they would see it, by squatting. Little is known about how many squatters are currently in Ireland. Most of them moved on or evicted, apparently, after short periods of time. Our reporter, Richard Chambers, has been looking into the matter and is with us now in studio. Richard, talk us through this. We used to hear about this happening in London. Is it a particularly new phenomenon here?
It sort of gained traction anyway, Shane, over the past number of years during the housing crisis and the recession. I mean, you'll probably remember the coverage of the occupation of the Squat City, as they called it, in Grangegorman. You had the Barricade Inn on Parnell Street as well, another particularly notorious one. And then Apollo House as well, I suppose. That involved some volunteers who had squatted before, or they were involved in that sort of community which is sort of spiralled around squatting. And since then, from talking to squatters around the country and those social groups formed around it, it's sort of been limited to individual houses, so vacant homes, mostly in Dublin, and they may have been lying there for months or for years empty, and they're picked out by the squatters and they move in, and it's seen by the public as something that's, it's almost filthy, and you get these images of people like huddled around matchsticks or fires and with no light and heat. But in many situations that's not really the case, and one guy who has been living like that is on and off squatter Dara, who's in his 20s. He came into squatting through meeting people who were involved at Gormanstown, and I met him in Dublin's north inner city, and he explained to me how he came to be in his most recent squat.
When we were changing the locks, the neighbour came out and asked, because apparently the house beside it, one of these houses, they had a renovation work, and builders, because the house was empty, had taken the liberty,
right,
in putting their tools there, and the neighbour thought the same thing was happening again. I did need a place to live myself. You've got to consider, these are people you're going to be living with. Do you get on well with them? There's maybe an element of suspicion, like is somebody a cop or something, but it's a bit unfounded, I think. So,
I mean, what sort of people are we talking about here? Do people have jobs?
I'm self-employed. I'm doing different things, deliveries and entertainment mainly. Squatting is not one homogenous group. It's all sorts, really. Like, for some people, this is their only means of avoiding street homelessness. You've got students, people working different jobs. Then you've got DIY folk, a lot of maybe transient people that are maybe only in Ireland for a while, or maybe some decide to stay, and they all find it one way or another. The idea of paying, what is it, 800 maybe on average for a small room, I can't afford that. I know I can't.
Okay, do we know? We don't know, do we, how many people are actually squatting in Ireland, do we?
It's almost impossible to do it. I mean, it's not all one group. There's so many different reasons and different subsections of this. From the people I've spoken to, whether that be squatters themselves or homeless charities, they guess anywhere between 40 and 70 squatters full-time in Dublin, and not a huge amount more than that in other places around the country. I've actually spoken to one guy in Galway who had been renting in the city for about 8 years before his landlord sold up, and now he's squatting in a building which was previously owned by the government. So in terms of identifying potential squats, this is quite interesting. You speak to some squatters, it's sort of it's quite simple. They almost check, if they're seeing if a house is vacant, they'll see if there's a mountain of post behind the door, if there's overgrowth in the garden, and a lot of people would work secret knocks and all that sort of stuff so as not to frighten off occupiers. It is a very secretive life though, Shane, as it would be obvious. And one group I met were up in Dublin City. They found 2 homes vacant beside each other in the north of the inner city, semi-detached, and it's basically knocked through the walls between the 2 houses into one giant squat, and they've been there for a couple of years at this stage, so they're one of the longer surviving ones. For most, though, it is a very, very short term thing, and you'll never generally last more than a couple of months in any one place, as Dara explains.
About 4 months in one place, and a month in another, and we're talking weeks in others. You can be lucky or not, and day-to-day life is just what you make of it. You've got it hanging over your head that you could be out of there if an owner shows up and wants you out.
The obvious questions people will be asking is, how do you get by in terms of light and heat or water? Or
you can call up the electricity company and get them to take over the account. It's just like a regular place. In fact, if you're walking down the street, you can't tell the difference between a squat and a home.
Did you ever have any sort of run-ins with neighbours and stuff like that?
Neighbours, as far as they're aware, they don't know you're necessarily squatting. You could tell them. Some of them were saying, these squatters think they have this artistic licence to be treated differently. And I can sympathise with that.
What happens when you are moved on?
If there's an illegal eviction, maybe the owners hire thugs and kick you out. You can try and protect yourself against that. And if it's a legal eviction, you'll be given maybe a week. After that date, then the guards could legally evict you from the premises.
Right. Which of those do you have more experience with?
Both. More experience with the legal evictions. When the notice of eviction gets nailed on the door, there's been a tendency not to contest that. You just walk out, you leave the place behind and let it be empty again.
Do you have any feeling that, okay, they might be doing something wrong here, that it's not their property, or how do they feel about that?
They understand, Shane, from speaking to many of them, that it's not, a solution to the housing crisis. They say it's a tactical response to it. From a legal perspective, I mean, squatting really isn't something that has a grounding in Irish law. You can apply for adverse possession as a third party after 12 years, or 6 if the actual owner has died and it hasn't been passed on or inherited. At this level, though, breaking and entering, though, is obviously a crime, as is trespass. So I asked Dara about this, about whether or not his friends and his family sort of knew that he was living in this way, and what he feels about the general situation.
I mean, I was upfront about it. I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of. In attaining your basic needs, and housing and shelter and food, and these are basic needs. At the time of a housing crisis, people are just going to fill the void, and they should. And they shouldn't be condemned for it. And it's not so difficult to walk around the city centre, spot empty houses and maybe make a home out of them. And that's the thing, you're talking about making a home out of what is just a vacant building. People have left these places, maybe they've forgotten about them, or you hear of people sitting on houses or properties and speculating the prices will rise. Maybe this isn't a crisis for everyone. It's working for some, to the advantage of some people. And I think we just need a major recalculation of how we set about dealing with providing houses for people. What we've ended up doing is not making a distinction between property that's lived in and property that's left dead. And you see the houses that you've lived in yourself and they're still empty. We're protecting tombs. And you look around the city and it looks sometimes like a graveyard.
Okay, I think people have different views on it. Richard Chambers, thanks indeed for that report.